Carla Lockhart.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and on behalf of our party, can I offer our deep sympathies to the family of those who have lost loved ones in the horrific incident in Creaslock. It's just heartbreaking to see the scenes and the funerals that are taking part. Our thoughts are very much with the families. It would be remiss of me at the outset not to point out that this matter is devolved to the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive, and therefore ought not to be a matter of decision for this place. The deliberate move by the government to bring this legislation through this place is yet another example of how the devolution settlement is set aside at the whim of the government of the day, if deemed politically expedient to do so. It would appear that this government is increasingly believes that the Northern Ireland Executive is best suited to perform a management board function rather than act as a democratically elected decision-making body. In doing so, it weakens local democracy and indeed the very reason for a return of devolution in what are already very challenging circumstances.
Would you give way
I will.
Does she also notice a correlation between matters being brought to this House and out of the hands of the Northern Ireland Assembly and the demands made by Sinn Féin for that to happen, even though they refuse to take their place in this House, but they're quite happy to lobby the government to use this House to get through the things which they want, and in most cases, things which concern Unionists, the government simply ignores?
Absolutely. Kowtow to the demands of Sinn Féin is often the way that it goes. For this reason, we will be seeking to vote against the bill at second reading, and we will be tabling amendments going forward. And should those changes not be made, we will continue to oppose the bill. Many contributions have already referenced New Decade, New Approach. It is almost as if that document consists of one issue, namely that of language and identity. It does not, Madam Deputy Speaker. I could list a range of commitments given by the government that are yet to be fulfilled. One, of course, relates to the UK internal market and Northern Ireland's place in that internal market. This remains unresolved, and I would remind the government that the now Prime Minister has given quite explicit commitments on the essential components of any solution to the issue of the protocol to this House. These must be delivered upon. Madam Deputy Speaker, language and identity are extremely sensitive issues within Northern Ireland. Sensitive because they mean a lot to sections of our population, whether that be those who cherish the Irish language and identity, or those for whom their Ulster Scots identity and language is fundamental to who they are and how they express themselves. It is a matter of deep regret that there have been times when language and identity, whether it be Irish or Ulster Scots, have been denigrated, abused by derision, or indeed abused by the weaponising of that language and identity by those for whom they are simply vehicles to pursue an overtly political goal. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is my belief that this legislation, rather than addressing the facilitation and respect for language and identity, is in fact a reward for those who have weaponised the Irish language for decades. Those people have neither love nor learning when it comes to Irish language. Their motive is rather to use it as part of a wider cultural war. Indeed, the legislation before us today to be imposed upon Northern Ireland society will only result in language and identity being a more potent weapon that causes greater damage to community relations and cohesion at a time when many of us wish to see a more united community focused on healing divisions, not aggravating it. Madam Deputy Speaker, very rarely in this House is the political dynamic of Northern Ireland talked about that we do not hear the words like consensus or phrases such as cross-community support. They are deemed the cornerstone of the political process and progress made to date. Yet today, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have legislation before the House that removes that cornerstone, and yet the self-proclaimed guardians of the Belfast Agreement are those behind its removal. You'll have plenty of opportunity to speak later. Part 2 of the bill is the very antithesis of cross-community consent. Specifically, Clause 6 and 7 provide carte blanche for the Secretary of State to do as he or she wishes in these deeply controversial policy areas, something that was not agreed at the NDNA. Clause 6 states the Secretary of State may do anything that a Northern Ireland Minister or Northern Ireland Department could do in the exercise of an identity and language function. Anything at all, regardless of the democratic mandate given to the Minister in that department, regardless of the manifesto that Minister may have stood before the electorate on and received his or her mandate. The power of direction taking precedence over the power of local voters, neither community consulted, rather instructed. Madam Deputy Speaker, with increasing tendency, cross-community safeguards at the heart of the Belfast and St Andrews Agreement are simply set aside when it suits the government to do so. The word disregarded in the bill stands out like a sore thumb. Whilst government figures and members of this House may be ordering a birthday cake to mark the 25th year of the Belfast Agreement next year, it is worth stating that the same people cannot have their cake and eat it. Surely you cannot celebrate something whilst at the same time destroying it. There is a deep-lying and justified suspicion within the Unionist community that such powers have only been taken and will only be used to appease the demands of the most vociferous and most divisive elements within the language and identity lobby. This being the case, it is not possible for us to support the legislation in which there are no safeguards to address the concerns of Unionists, and indeed those of a non-Unionist persuasion who do not subscribe to the radical agenda of the language and identity lobbies. We rightly question whether the vast amount of public money set aside to satisfy those demands is the best use of finite public resources. Madam Deputy Speaker, the data from the 2021 census of Northern Ireland shows that 228,617 people have some ability in Irish, with almost the same number, 190,613, having some ability in Ulster Scots. On the basis of these numbers alone, it is hard to rationalise the disparity in terms of this legislation between the status and powers of the Irish Language Commissioner and that of the Commissioner for the Ulster Scots and the Ulster British tradition. It is a matter of deep regret that amendments tabled in the other place that could have provided recourse for at least some of these legislative inequalities were not accepted. In doing so, it further cements beliefs among Unionists that the government is more concerned with the concerns of one community over the other. That is a dangerous mindset in the context of Northern Ireland. If the government is serious about providing some degree of balance in this bill, it must look at a number of areas with reference to the powers of the Commissioner for the Ulster Scots and Ulster British tradition. The DUP believe that the functions of the Commissioner should be extended to explicitly reference heritage and culture. Currently, the legislation only provides for language, arts and literature. If the ambition for this legislation to make it as comprehensive as possible, then such a change would be desirable to better reflect the extent and importance of these distinct traditions. Furthermore, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are a series of shortcomings in the legislation relating to how the Commissioners can respond to alleged breaches by public authorities of the requirements relating to Irish language and Ulster Scots. Should a public body face an alleged breach and is found to be culpable, the Irish Commissioner can make recommendations on how a public body, and I quote, can remedy its failure and avoid future failures. In terms of the Ulster British Commissioner, however, the remit is much less, only giving advice on how a body might have better regard to published facilitation guidance. insulting to say the least. Furthermore, the admissibility grounds to even make a valid complaint are much weightier in relation to Irish, even when it comes to devising an action plan on how a public authority will fulfil its obligations. There appears to be a requirement when it comes to Irish, but not similar requirements when it's Ulster British. In his summing up, I would ask the Secretary of State to specifically address this point and to explain how such imbalance is in the public interest and how it represents a balanced approach to both identities. As I draw my remarks to a conclusion, let us not ignore the costs that will be associated with this bill. If, and it is a big if, an executive be restored, it will have an in-tray of issues that will come at unprecedented cost to the public purse, delivering on the Bengoa reforms to our health service, investment in schools, addressing historic underfunding of special educational needs, road and rail investments, tackling the problems associated with the water network that is crumbling. Yet what this legislation will do is take money away from these priorities that impact on us all, regardless of our identity, and add further strain to the budgets of public authorities. What is more important, a bed for a cancer patient or an Irish or Ulster Scots translation of a public document that can be read in English by all? I would urge the government to think long and hard about the core message this legislation sends to those in Northern Ireland, not just around the lack of balance, as I've outlined, but fundamentally to consider the wisdom of cultural supremacy being enshrined in law. Thank you.
Well done, Carla.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hadn't